Hello everybody, and thank you all for joining us again here today on Haskins County for another SRD Talk. This video series takes a look at system reference documents for role-playing games, as well as other sorts of framework-style role-playing games, generic-style role-playing games that could be utilized to serve as the basis for some of your own games. Today we're going to be taking a look at a new system that we have not discussed yet called JARS, or Just Another Role-Playing System. This was created by Roxanne B, otherwise known on the internet as Sludgepunk. The basic idea behind JARS is that it is a single-page role-playing system framework. In fact, the entirety of the current text can be found on this page right here, so it's front and back. It is available for license under the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 4.0 license, so that is something you want to keep in mind if you potentially want to use this system for your own games. Just keep in mind that you are going to also have to use that Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license for your system as well. Now, just to go over some basic inspirations that Roxanne mentions in the text. So first of all, this is really pulls a whole lot from Powered by the Apocolypse style games, particularly the types of complications, the way that characters can potentially retire also pulls a lot from Powers of the Apocolypse, and the one of the different versions of the dice resolution system is essentially Powered by the Apocolypse, very heavily inspired by that. Another element that has inspired this particular system is the game Over the Edge. I won't go into the specifics of exactly what Over the Edge is, in part because I only know of it through reputation, and I have not actually played it or read it very much in depth myself. But one of the features of it is that it has character traits or attributes that are heavily player defined. Essentially, this is for those of you who've watched videos of mine before. This has some very similar elements to, for example, my the sort of blossom structure that I use in some of my games, where the players determine the specific elements that basically define their character, and those in turn define whenever that character should be gaining bonuses for certain roles or negatives in certain cases as well. Finally, the last system that Roxanne mentions specifically as an inspiration is Tenra Bansho Zero. This is a JRPG that came out I'm pretty sure the original game came out in the 90s, and it's gone under several iterations. Since then, it was translated to English by the same people who translated there's a Shinobi game, and then also Shinobi Gama, and then the Ryutama game. But in any case, one of the things from that I really feel that Roxanne is pulling from that is specifically the karma die that we'll discuss in just a minute. That it really feels like it's coming from that. And then also there's some elements of just the general feeling of this that seems to really connect to Tenra Bansho. Although there might be some other elements. Again, that's another one of these games where I kind of know it by reputation, and I've read a little bit of it, but I don't know it I'm not as informed on the exact specific mechanics or structure or feeling of the game because I've never actually played it myself. But in any case, moving on from that, let's go ahead, and I mentioned that the dice resolution system in many ways kind of pulls from Powered by the Apocolypse, so this is going to be pretty familiar to a lot of you. They're basically two versions of this dice creation system that Roxanne mentions as being options for creators. Either way, they're based off of a 2d6 system that you then add your modifiers to. Now, the first option is that basically you just have it where, okay, the referee will set a target number somewhere between presumably 2 and 12. And then, if you hit that, then you succeed. If you get below that, you don't succeed. And double sixes are always a critical success. So yeah, and we'll discuss the specifics of what happens if you get a critical success in just a second. However, there is also, of course, the standard Powered by the Apocalypse scale, where you have anything under a 6 being a failure, a 7 through 9 being a partial success, anything above a 10 being a success, and then, of course, again, if you roll double sixes, then that is a critical success. Now, what's important to note, though, when it comes to those critical successes is that obviously you succeed, you also get to sort of change the situation or the narrative in a way that will benefit your character. But finally, also, as a part of that sort of changing the situation, you also get a +2 bonus to your next roll. Finally, I mentioned that karma die. Like I mentioned earlier, the inspiration from this really feels to me like it's coming from the Tenra Bansho. And in Tenra Bansho Zero, that system, it's really modeled off of like kabuki theater. So the audience is really heavily involved in that, can step in, play roles in certain elements of the story in Tenra Bansho, not in kabuki theater. But anyway, either way, the audience is still pretty heavily involved. And one of the ways that Tenra Bansho and this game does that, shows that, is by allowing the players to reward if they're doing play in a certain way that they enjoy, or that they think is really fitting for the situation. They can reward each other karma points, or karma die in this case, or in the original example of Tenra Bansho, there's a multi-layered currency. This is a simplified version of that. So basically, each player has essentially a karma die that they can reward to another player. They can reward up to 1 die per session. The player who then uses that karma die for their character will get +2 on a roll that they're doing. However, if that karma die is unspent by the end of the session, then it is lost. It doesn't stick with your character. So in many ways, this is kind of like a bardic inspiration. For those of you who are or more familiar with just D&D instead of some other examples I could pull there, +2 in this 2d6 system, dice system is a pretty considerable bonus. Now, as I mentioned, one of the major inspirations that we're pulling in here from Over the Edge is that players define the elements that make up their character instead of like picking from lists or pre-existing classes or stuff like that. So in this system, in this Just Another Role-Playing System in JARS, you have every character is going to have one identity that basically marks out the core concepts of your character. So for example, in many ways, this could be like a profession or some other major element of the character's identity. Like, for example, maybe you're a physician, you're an occultist, you're a university student. And so whenever your character is doing actions that would depend on that identity, whether it's utilizing some skills that just seem to naturally come with this particular core concept, or relying on the types of knowledge that a character that a person who is in that profession or would normally be having the experiences of that type of person with that identity would get a +2 or a -2 to their roll. Because of course, your identity is not always an advantage for you. So a good example of this might be, okay, you say your character is a knave, right? You're an outlaw. That means that you might have a +2 when you're doing certain things, like trying to make yourself look threatening, right? Or picking locks or stealing things, if you're a rogue type character, let's say. But in some cases, like if you're trying to convince the guard of that you have evidence of somebody else doing a wrongdoing, that might not be a positive because you already have a reputation for being someone who's not straight and narrow with the laws. That's obviously a problem. So that's the identity. Each of the characters will also have 3 traits. So these are skills or abilities or other things that your character might have picked up that doesn't really fall under the types of things that would be under your identity. So for example, maybe your knave also happens to be a psychic, or maybe you're a physician, but you're also really good at lockpicking, or you're a mechanic, but you also are have a lot of experience with literature, and and so as a result you'd have skills that would help you with writing or reading things, understanding things, philosophy, stuff like that. So these particular cases, again, just like with your core concept identity for your character, you're going to be either adding or subtracting +1 from your roll depending upon whether or not this particular trait is an asset or a disadvantage. Now, we've discussed the core roll and how those work. We've also discussed what identity and traits are and when they apply. But what happens when you fail? Upon failing, obviously, besides not succeeding, your player will then be rolling a d6, and then they have a 33% chance, a 1 in 3 chance so a 1 or a 2, of getting a complication. This complication is essentially a temporary malice to your character. It's a penalty to your character that can eventually go away with time, or if you spend effort into trying to fix the problem. So, for example, you're injured, right? Maybe you're under high amounts of stress. You're absolutely enraged. You are suffering from environmental exposures of some kind or another, like, feeling sick because, of course, you've been exposed to too much smoke, or you got too cold, or whatever. These complications can potentially go away through healing or whatever, but eventually if you accumulate a certain number of complications, then eventually you will get what the game refers to as notches. This in many ways is similar to scars in certain types of Powered by the Apocalypse games. These are essentially permanent changes to your characters that cannot be removed. So, for example, you might have, if you're an outlaw, you might have a bounty put on your head, right? You might have gained a new scar. Maybe you have developed some form of an addiction, or a dependency on something, or you've picked something up that could potentially be a disadvantage for you. Now, and again, these are things that are permanently changing your character. I would also argue that some of these notches could potentially be advantages in certain situations. So although it doesn't explicitly mention it in jars, Roxanne does not go into complication. Roxanne goes into how complications can potentially prevent or hamper your character from doing certain things, but Roxanne doesn't talk about what the effects of notches could be. I would argue that notches could potentially give you a penalty or an advantage in certain situations, maybe akin to a trait. And in many ways, that would also fit into the way that Tenra Bansho Zero kind of handles stuff like this, in that as your character fails and then becomes changed as a result of the failures or complications that they're experiencing, and they can actually become more powerful. And eventually, at a certain point, where they get powerful enough to the point where they basically no longer become characters anymore. They essentially lose the script and kind of go off and do their own thing. And in many ways, the same thing your characters would be experiencing here, because once they achieve a certain number of notches, it's generally required that your character has to retire. Whether that means your character dies, your character becomes an NPC, your character just kind of disappears. However your group or yourself decide that it's the best way to kind of handle that would really be up to you. If I was refereeing or facilitating a game based on jars, I would probably have those notches also have benefits for the character, partly to offset complications and also give your character an opportunity for growth through change, because this system does not have in it a character advancement system. So that's something else I want to just keep in mind. Now, using jars, how should we really use this? Remember, this is a framework. Again, there are things you can add. There are things you can change. Like, for example, what I just mentioned about the potentially having notches, giving characters bonuses or malices depending upon certain situations. These are all things that are definitely open for you to do, because of course it's an SRD. That's just how SRDs work. Now, Roxanne currently is using this particular system in order to create a low-powered sort of superhero vigilante game. Roxanne also made some mentions of like this being somewhat inspired by the X-Men. So the types of games that Roxanne and also myself would see potentially working well with this would be narrative style games that have a rotating cast. So make it so that players don't necessarily feel wedded to playing this one character every time, all the time. Instead, it would be good to potentially have, okay, again, going back to the X-Men reference, let's say, okay, Johnny's playing Beast today, but if later on, if for example, maybe it makes narrative sense for Beast to be going and doing something else. Maybe instead Johnny will end up playing Wolverine instead, or Cyclops or whatever. So yeah, the definitely narrative style games with rotating casts, these would definitely be preferable for this particular system and the way it's structured over more mechanically detailed play and characters. Another thing you'll notice is that I have not explicitly mentioned any type of combat mechanic. Part of that is just because Roxanne actually explicitly mentions in one or two places that that combat really should kind of work the same way that regular actions do. So with those core roles, and I also kind of agree with them on that particular element, especially if we're talking about a more narrative-focused game. It just having crunchy combat mechanics just doesn't feel right. It would make more sense to just have that be like a like 2 or 3 series of rolls and that's it, as opposed to it being like a full-blown nitty-gritty walking on a map sort of style stuff, unless you feel like it's really necessary for this particular situation. And one other thing, if you're not necessarily wild about your Powered by the Apocolypse resolution system, and the way that the penalties and bonuses work, of course, you can change that. It might be useful to try pools instead. I would still call it a jars game, because to me, the element of jars that really feels key to the system is not so much the dice resolution as much as it is the identity and traits, the complications and notches, and then that karma dice. All of that elements to me feels like key jars and not necessarily the dice, the core rolls. And yeah, so that's why I would say that in this particular system, playing around with the dice are fine, right? As opposed to some of the other elements that I feel are really key to, like involving more the character creation and evolution of the characters. And again, that was Jars, or Just Another Role-Playing System by Roxanne B, otherwise known on the internet as Sludge Punk. Yeah, Sludge Punk is the username that Roxanne uses on Blue Sky and on Itch. So you can find this particular document on their Itch page. I will put links, of course, down below for it. There aren't any games that I'm aware of that are released that use this system, although you never know. I might make one. I'm admittedly tempted. I am not the biggest of fan of that Powered by the Apocolypse rolling system. So if I were to make something based on jars, again, I would probably do more of like a blend of jars and sort of the some of the other stuff that I do, but we'll see. In any case, thank you all for joining us again here today on Hessens County for another SRD Talk looking at jars. Don't forget to rate your itch purchases. Go out there, have a great day, and check this out. Have a good day.